Hello, welcome to another episode of Field of Screams podcast. Today we will be talking about Friday the 13th, Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. For the 8th installment of this franchise, the studio decided to bring in Rob Hedden, who had not directed a movie yet in his career, and they asked him to direct this next movie and help write it. Hedden wanted to take Jason out of Camp Crystal Lake. And after watching the first 7, marathoning these, it does seem like a good idea. We've probably done all that we could do at Camp Crystal Lake. Let's take him out. And the studio even recommended, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we took him to New York City? So Rob got all excited and he wrote this gigantic script to where Jason was going to be interrupting Broadway plays. He was going to be diving off the Statue of Liberty. He was even going to be on the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a really ambitious script that Rob wrote. So when he turned in the script and kind of told him all of his ideas, they decided to give him a $5 million budget, which is a far bigger budget than any movie had received thus far. The problem with the $5 million budget is, though, that's not enough to film an entire movie in New York City. Really, it was enough to film in New York City for 2 days. So they had a problem, so Rob had to rewrite the script, and that's why we get this movie that we have now, where a lot of the movie takes place on a boat. And even the parts in New York City, they're really filmed in Vancouver instead. Really, I think they said they got one scene in New York City, but then I heard another thing where they had 2 days to film in New York City. So let's talk about this movie a little bit. So I will say the movie has a very cool opening credits. It's playing a pretty catchy song called The Darkest Side of the Night. It's showing pretty grimy scenes of New York. It's showing some cool sights that we later see in the movie. Overall, opening credits, it's not that bad. It kind of gets you excited. It's like, oh man, New York vibes. Here we go. But then the actual movie starts to where there's a couple that has a boat, and of course the couple it starts right off with them fooling around. Classic Friday the 13th nature. And after they get done fooling around, the guy tells a girl the backstory of Jason, just in case you forgot after the first 7 movies. And as he's telling the backstory, he's talking about how Jason drowned in Camp Crystal Lake, and it does a flashback to Jason, and Jason is just a normal-looking boy drowning in the lake. And it's kind of like, wait, I recall Jason being deformed, but whatever, let's move on. And then as he's telling this story, their boat hits the chain that is chaining Jason down into the lake, which, by the way, with this lake, you see Camp Crystal Lake. It's a campground now, whereas the last movie, there was houses. They changed it in part 7, which was kind of weird in itself because 6, it was a campground. 7, it goes to houses, and now 8, it's a campground again. I don't know. But anyways, it frees Jason up. Jason climbs aboard the ship, kills him off, and when he kills the girl off, he literally has this spear, and he lowers it towards her very, very slowly, and she makes no attempt to get out of the way. It's pretty cheesy. It's not that gory. And then that boat kind of drifts off near this cruise ship, to where I guess this high school is sending off these seniors on this gigantic cruise. Lucky them. My high school didn't do that. And let's ignore the fact that, of all the Friday the 13th movies, we've never seen the lake kind of go off into a stream that connects with an ocean. I don't know how this boat gets to this cruise ship. You just have to ignore the lack of realism, because the movie doesn't get any better as far as that goes. But even the students on this cruise ship, they're shooting skis. They have rifles on this boat. And it just made me think of in how today's culture, and I highly doubt back in the 80s and 90s that they would be able to also. But just letting students bring guns onto this cruise ship and fire away, all the other stuff they did was cool. They got to dance, they got to play games, but once I seen them shooting guns, I was like, oh, come on, really? But again, it's a Friday the 13th movie, so I guess we got to give it a pass. I don't know, the other movies, like, there's always the little things that make you question what's going on, like, the realism of it all. But this movie really pushes the boundaries of, like, really, they're doing that? Okay. Well, Jason ends up climbing this cruise ship to join all the senior students, which, again, the first shots of the senior students, like, this boat is loaded with people when it shows them taking off. And that's kind of the thing with low-budget movies. Like, they like to do this with extras. Like, they have a bunch of people get on the boat, so it's a really cool shot. It looks like a fun party and all this stuff. And then when you get into the nitty-gritty scenes of the actual characters in the movie, there wasn't that many people on this boat. You know, Jason runs around and he kills a bunch of them. But I mean, I swear when this movie starts, it looks like there's about 50 students on this boat. And then as it gets going, it looks like we're down to about 12 or 14 pretty quickly. Probably not even 12. I don't know. Also on this boat, there is a worker, a seaman, I guess you could call him. But they try to do the crazy Ralph impersonation, where he just walks around and he's like, he's back. We're doomed. This voyage is doomed. And it's just an unnecessary callback. I mean, we all miss Crazy Ralph, but this guy isn't going to fill the void. They try it anyways, though. Some of the senior students that we get to know is Rennie, who will be our final girl. We have Sean, who is the final girl's love interest. I mean, there's that void every Friday the 13th movie. We have JJ, who's a rocker chick. She's actually kind of cool. I wish we would have saw a little bit more of her. She ends up just getting smashed in the face with her guitar. We have Wayne, who's just like this ugly geek. We have Tamara and Eva, who are the popular girls. There's a scene of them about to do drugs. Eva gets nervous, and Tamara's like, Eva, come on. I'm the prom queen. You'll be fine. And it's like, oh, I guess prom queens get a pass to just do drugs whenever and wherever they want. Okay. We have Julius, who's this cocky boxer, and is probably the best character in the film. I really like Julius. When things hit the fan, he's literally just chomping at the bit to go fight Jason. That's all he wants to do. He's like, man, let's take this guy on. Let's all get him. You love Julius in this film. If you love any characters at all, it's going to be Julius. We have some other characters who are just kind of body bags for Jason. There's a guy named Miles. You don't really know a whole lot about him. But I mean, during his scene, I started noticing that they were using Jason's teleportation. Earlier in the series, you know, you hear a lot of rumors and stuff and theories about how Jason can teleport. And there's some examples earlier in the franchise where you're like, oh yeah, like how could he do that? Or why would he do that? Like, he had to teleport. It's supernatural, maybe. This movie goes full on into it. I believe the director said there is no teleportation, but there is no way, because this guy, Miles, he runs into Jason, turns around, climbs up this, I don't know my parts of the boats. I think it's like the mast, like the really tall wooden part of the ship, climbs all the way on top, and then he looks up and Jason's up there waiting for him. No clue how he got up there. He had to teleport. I mean, if there's a movie to where you're saying Jason does teleport and he's supernatural, it's because you've watched this movie, because he teleports a ton. But yeah, he throws Miles off, and Miles gets impaled, and that's how he dies. It's actually kind of a cool kill. This movie lacks in cool kills, so when you get one, it's pretty nice. There's an admiral. He gets his throat slit with the wrong side of the machete during this movie. There's another guy that Julius was boxing. He was laying down in a sauna, and Jason shoves a rock through his stomach. One of the hot rocks, of course. And that's how he goes. He was originally going to get darts in the eyes, but of course the MPAA, with their censorship and them constantly going after the Friday the 13th series, they took away that scene completely. For whatever reason, having darts in the eyes, they wouldn't let fly, so instead they let Jason shove a hot rock into his stomach and leave a big bloody hole. I don't know, I guess that's more acceptable. With the last movie, Part 7, getting just torched with the censorship, the director didn't even film gory scenes for this movie. He kind of took the anti-approach the director in Part 5 did. Part 5, he ramped up the gore and was negotiating like crazy. This guy has a lot of cutaway kills that aren't bloody, and they're just very simple. That's kind of disappointing sometimes. We have Rennie's Uncle Charles, who is supposed to be a teacher chaperone on this trip. I mean, he's kind of the creep in the movie. Everything bad that happens between the characters, it's usually kind of his fault. Charles goes up to Tamara and starts pestering her about like a biology project, which, I mean, most schools make students take biology their freshman year, so I don't know why Tamara is missing a biology assignment as prom queen. I mean, if a prom queen's taken biology her senior year, it's weird, but okay. And I mean, if you're doing a celebration senior boat trip, you would think they would make sure they have all the assignments turned in by this point. But again, realism doesn't really exist in this movie. But he's pestering her like, hey, you didn't turn that in, like, you shouldn't be here. And Tamara decides to seduce him. And it works when she drops all of her clothes and she writes like this biology stuff on her body. Charles is just kind of like, hey. And then he goes fully into it. And then about a minute or two later, he's kind of like snaps out of it and goes, wait a minute, I'm your teacher. But it's too late because Wayne, ugly Wayne, pops out of the closet with a camera and is like, gotcha. And then they blackmail him. And you might think like, oh, that might serve a purpose later in this movie. No, it doesn't. Tamara and Eve get killed off pretty early on in this boat. And so does Wayne. Tamara, she of course gets killed off screen. Jason throws her around in the bathroom, breaks the glass. And it looks like it's going to be a pretty vicious kill because she's like in the nude. And she's like screaming and you almost kind of feel bad. But then the camera cuts away and it's like, oh, that's what we're doing here. And I guess the actress who played Tamara, she was really uncomfortable with doing nude scenes. And the director said, well, I'll do the scene nude too. And she actually thought it was pretty funny. And it got her kind of amped up to do the scene. And she did it. So yeah, that worked. And then we have Eva, who goes to check on Tamara, and of course she's dead, and Jason chases her onto the dance floor. Apparently the drugs they took were taking effect because Eve starts seeing stuff, and as she's like spinning around, like Jason's around every corner of the room. And then finally he kills her off pretty easily too. And then let's talk about Wayne's death scene. Because there's not a whole lot to Wayne, besides he's ugly and a nerd, and he helped Tamara and Eve with their little blackmail project. Wayne finds a gun on this boat, and he's going to hunt down Jason. He gets his glasses knocked off, which, without his glasses, he has the eyesight of a mole, basically. And he starts shooting at anything that moves, and he shoots a crewmate on the ship. And then Jason grabs him, picks him up, and throws him into electrical equipment, which shocks him very badly and causes him to catch on fire, which you can tell is clearly a dummy. But I actually liked when he threw Wayne into the electrical equipment. I thought it was kind of funny. Now, I've basically covered most of the stuff that goes on in the boat. And unfortunately, it's a gigantic chunk of the movie, and the movie moves very slowly. And if you're going to see this movie thinking Jason's going to be in New York, you are going to be sorely disappointed, especially with all this boat scenes. And there's not a whole lot to it, especially with everything in the previous franchise. And, in the beginning where I was like, oh, good, they're taking Jason out of the camp. Cool. By the time, we're in this boat, I'm just ready to go back to camp. I'm like, man, let's go back to Camp Crystal Lake. I miss the good times. I start to feel very nostalgic. But, we do get off this boat because the boat starts going crazy. It starts flooding. The boat's going down. So they got to get a little rescue boat. And the remaining high schoolers and Charles, they row their way back to New York. And this is where the movie gets kind of fun. When they get to New York, Jason follows them all the way there. Don't know how, but he does. And when he finally does, there's a billboard of Jason in a hockey mask, and Jason just kind of tilts his head and looks at it. And they do this like a little funny scene where the camera pans back, and there's Jason on the billboard, and then Jason turns around and looks at the camera like, what? And it's just kind of a meta moment. It's funny. Our main characters, they travel around New York, and they run into these two junkies who we see in the beginning credits of the film. Literally, it's just them shooting up. It's like the camera pans on them for about 6-7 seconds during the opening credits. But we run into them again, our favorite junkies. And they go up, they shoot in the direction of a dog, they point the gun at Rennie and pull her away from the group. They inject drugs into her. And then it's kind of hinted that they're going to like sexually assault her. But Jason steps in to save the day. And he kills the druggies. One of them by using the needle. Stabs him in the back with it. And then the other one, he slams his head against a pipe. And it's kind of ironic. I think they did it on purpose. They killed one junkie by shooting up with the needle. And then they killed the other one by hitting the pipe. Yeah, jokes. Then we get what is my favorite scene in this movie. And that is Julius taking on Jason. Jason follows him up all the way on top of a rooftop. And they kind of go at it. And by go at it, I mean Julius gets some punches in. I mean, previously in this franchise, if you're not a final girl, you're not going to get very many hits in. We've seen final girls take on Jason with chainsaws, all this cool stuff. But Julius, he punches Jason. And then, the scene's actually pretty cool. Of course, with the panned out shots, they kind of have a stunt coordinator. But the close-up, it's actually the actor doing the punches. And it's a cool little scene. He lets loose on Jason, gets him all the way to the edge of the building to where Julius is finally tired out. And then he tells Jason, hey, take your shot. And Jason literally punches his head off, knocks his block off, and his head goes flying. It's a fun scene. Now, our final girl, Rennie. Earlier in the movie on the boat, she had some visions, some hallucinations. She keeps seeing the swamp boy. Every time she looks out a window, there's just this dirty, grimy swamp boy. Which, by the way, is the editor of this movie. That's his son who plays that boy. So that's kind of cool. But the swamp boy, every time we see him, the consistency of the makeup. Sometimes he looks normal. Other times he's a little deformed. Then he's really deformed. They're never consistent at all about this. And it's kind of funny each time you see him. Which version are you going to get of the swamp boy? But you kind of wonder, why does she have this trauma with water? Well, in New York, we kind of get the explanation to where her Uncle Charles took her to Camp Crystal Lake when she was a little girl, and he decides to throw her into the water to teach her how to swim. And of course she doesn't know how to swim, so she sinks down into the lake, and when she does, she sees little boy Jason somehow. He's just swimming at the bottom of Camp Crystal Lake. He pops out and he's kind of like hooga booga, and she's tortured for the rest of her life because of that moment. Thanks, Uncle Charles. So you get the little rationale of that moment when they're in New York. And then, of course, when you learn this and you're like, man, Charles is a bad dude. Which, if you didn't get that from one of his first scenes where he's seduced by a student, I don't know what to tell you. But now they really hammer it in, and all the other characters are like, yeah, screw Charles. They finish him off by having Jason dunk him headfirst into a barrel of sludge and dead rats. And it's actually a pretty good scene. Kane Hodder goes ham on him, dunks him in pretty hard, and it's a pretty violent scene, especially for this movie. There's not a lot of violence with the kill, so this one of Jason going ham, it's nice to see. Eventually we get down to it's just Rennie and Sean. And it's a chase scene with Jason following them around in supposedly what's New York. I mean, some of it's kind of lame. There's like romance scenes in it where they pause and they start kissing, and by this point you're like, who cares? Like, no one's invested in this relationship. Like, give us something we care about. But there is a moment to where Jason's walking and there's these kind of group of kids and they have this boombox and they're just chilling. And Jason walks up and absolutely punts it. I mean, I love this scene. I crack up at it. I think it's pretty funny. And the kids, they pull out a knife and they kind of challenge Jason, and Jason lifts up his mask, and just the side of his face, they run away. It's kind of funny. I like it, especially in the spirit of this movie. I mean, no one's going to take this movie seriously by this point, so you might as well just ham it up. They go into a cafe. They tell a waitress that some psycho killer is trying to kill them, and the waitress doesn't even blink an eye, and she's like, welcome to New York. And of course Jason storms in and causes mayhem in the cafe. And after about this point, they decide the only safe place they could go is into the sewers, the New York sewers. And while they're down there, they don't know how the New York sewer system works, because there is a worker down there, and he's kind of like, hey, what are you guys doing? And they're like, oh, we're running from a serial killer. And then the worker explains the rules of the New York sewer system. He's like, didn't you know that toxic waste floods this place every night at midnight? And it's kind of just like, you take a moment and you're like, what? Who wrote those rules? Like, what mayor or politician or person decided, you know what? Toxic waste is going to flood the sewer system every night at midnight, because that makes sense. I don't know. Like, again, like, you just gotta laugh. You gotta laugh at this point. And of course Jason goes down there, kills the worker. And they're trying to escape, and they're climbing up the manhole, and of course it's midnight, so Jason didn't know the toxic waste rule either, because the toxic waste comes in and he gets soaked in it, and while it's hitting him, he turns and his face is just like an abomination. It looks like a little Play-Doh figure, and it's like, Mommy! And he starts vomiting all over the place while going, Mommy! The scene's just out there. I don't know who approved this. It's awful. But by the end of it all, Jason turns into a little boy, and he's just laying there. It makes no sense whatsoever. Not a lot in this movie does, but I guess if that's how they're going to end it, that's how they're going to end it. But I mean, him talking as a kid, I'm laughing now, and just vomiting randomly. Like, it looks like Team America, where that puppet's just like vomiting all over, and it just looks fake as can be. Like, that's basically what happens to Jason, except he's yelling Mommy like a little boy. Yeah, that's how this ends. So, this movie, I mean, we're to this point. We're at part 8. We are far in the franchise. I mean, I've already kind of talked about last time. We're in the era of gimmicks. And this one is a very bad gimmick. They promise us New York. We don't get it. We get it for a split second. There's a lot of things that just make no sense. Jason going from Camp Crystal Lake all the way to New York somehow on a cruise full of students shooting guns where they're seducing teachers. And they somehow get to New York on a rowboat, which Jason follows, and the toxic waste that floods the sewers that makes Jason vomit and scream, Mommy! That's just where we are. And I'm glad this movie is over, and I don't have to watch it again. I remembered it was bad, but just kind of watching it back now, it was like, man, I did not misremember that. I was right. It's pretty bad. It's a pretty bad movie. If you enjoy it, because I do know there are people that like this movie, I'm guessing they like it because it's fun to them. It's funny. Like, I mean, even when I say it's bad, there are parts I laugh at. I laugh at the boombox. I laugh at Jason vomiting. It's silly, it's crazy, it's wacky, it makes no sense. It's in New York. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up my review of this film. I don't think I can go on about it much longer. I mean, hopefully you've enjoyed listening to me talk about this film. If you like it, please give this episode a like. It always helps the channel. It helps it reach other people. Feel free to subscribe so that you know when the next episode comes out. Of course, we are doing Jason Goes to Hell. Yippee. A very different film. But I appreciate to all those that listen and tune in. I really appreciate that, guys. So next time, we'll be in hell. Until next time.